Testing 1 2 3. Testing.
Oh, because you're not going through the. You're not going through the speakers. You're
I'm not sure if I'm used to VBS or if you guys are just a really obedient class. Goodness gracious. And it's not even two minutes past time, so you guys are doing great. Go ahead and turn to the book of Nehemiah. We're going to pick up there with our study tonight. We've been out of the saddle for a little bit, so hopefully we can do a little recap tonight of what we've been talking about and discussing, and then we can hopefully finish off the rest of the book of Nehemiah and move on to other things before our semester is over. Before we do that, I'm going to ask Carrie to go ahead and lead us in an opening prayer. Amen. Well, it was my intention, I don't know if you did or not, but it was my intention to put this question up here a little bit early so you guys could think about it and mull it over and consider how you'd respond to it. But I do want to open class by asking simply, what does it mean for a heart to be strengthened by grace? And I put the scripture quote there so you know I'm not just making stuff up. We see that language in Hebrews 13 and verse 9. So when you hear that idea of a heart strengthened by grace, what does that mean to you? What do you think that means? Yes, sir. Okay, so the idea that God has shown us grace and has been so forgiving, compassionate to us, it changes how we approach Him in the future. That strengthens us in that way. Yes, sir. Yeah, so witnessing the grace of God and all the kindness that He showed them and delivered them from Egypt, it gives them strength to move forward and go on with their journey. What else? What do you think of when you hear the term strengthened by grace or heart strengthened by grace? Yes, so it motivates us to obey Him and to continue doing what He asks us to do. It strengthens us to do that. And in a way, it enables us to do that, right? When we fall flat on our face, the thing that enables us to get back up and be reassured and strengthened to do better is the idea that we know God is a God of grace who will show us mercy for our shortcomings and allow us to try again. I begin with this in Hebrews 13 and verse 9 because it has a lot to do with what's about to happen at the end of Nehemiah. In context, I should say this just in case anybody is going to be a stickler on this. In Hebrews chapter 13, this idea of being strengthened by grace, it is in contrast to what the entire book is about. The book of Hebrews is about convincing Jews to stick with Christ. There are some people, some Jews in that time, who thought it would be better to return to the old law and serve God through that system, right? We're suffering as Christians. Let's go ahead and become Jews again and serve God that way so we won't be persecuted. And the whole book of Hebrews is about how, hey, that doesn't work. You can't go back to the old law and serve Him and make Him happy that way. You have to serve Him through the new law and through Christ. And so in Hebrews 13 and verse 9, if you read the whole text, it says, "Do not be carried away by varied and strange teaching, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods, through which those who are so occupied were not benefited." And so the whole thing that's happening here, he's using that reference about food as a stand-in for all of the old law. And the idea is, don't strengthen your heart, don't reassure yourself about your standing with God by observing the old law, especially all those requirements about eating foods and all that stuff. It's not good for your heart to be strengthened by observing the law of Moses. What's good is for your heart to be strengthened by the grace of God that we receive in Jesus Christ. In other words, the thing that should invigorate us and strengthen us and reassure us in our faith is not thinking to ourselves, hey, I'm keeping the old law, but it is thinking God is a gracious God. That is the thing that strengthens our heart. The fact that God in Christ stands ready to cleanse and forgive over and over and over again, so long as I'm ready to truly strive and try again. That is the greatest encouragement to a Christian, isn't it? As long as I'm willing to try again, God is willing to receive me again. And I think that, again, that speaks to what we're covering in these restoration books, because that's something that we see over and over and over again. We see God's people who have been saved from captivity fall flat on their face again and again and again, and we see that God is willing to work with them again and again and again, despite their shortcomings. We see that all over the place. We see that in Ezra chapter 1, the fact that they're returning from exile. They had been wicked against God. They had served idols. They'd done all these wicked things. But after 70 years, God is willing to say, I'm going to let you free, and I'm going to let you go home. Even though you've done all this bad stuff, I'm going to let you go home, and I'm going to keep my promise to you. He's willing to work with them again. We see that in Ezra chapter 5. You'll remember that God sent them home so that they could rebuild the temple and restore the right worship of God. And because they got scared of their adversaries around them, they stopped building. So God had to send Haggai and Zechariah to stir them up again and get them doing the things they need to be doing. And again, we see they failed, but God's willing to work with them again if they're willing to strive. We see that in Ezra chapter 7 with the arrival of Ezra. The people had spent 52 years in that place, but God sends Ezra, a man skilled in the law of Moses, who's knowledgeable and able to teach, to help them better understand God's law, to bring them to a better understanding that they didn't have before. We see that in Ezra 9 and 10. When Ezra realizes that these people have broken one of God's main commandments given to them in the old law, that you're not supposed to intermarry with the other nations. And so Ezra calls attention to that and calls the people to repentance. And so they put away their foreign wives, and they begin a dedication to Him once again, and God is willing to work with them again. We see that in Nehemiah chapter 1, where they've been living in Jerusalem. They haven't done anything on the walls, but God is willing to send Nehemiah to help them rebuild those walls. We see that in Nehemiah chapter 5, when in the midst of this rebuilding of the walls process, they find out that the nobles, the leaders, are extracting usury against the lowly members of the community. The leaders are oppressing their own brethren and violating the law of Moses, and yet they fix that issue, and God is willing to work with them again. We see that in Nehemiah chapter 8, where we learn that they have not been observing one of the main Jewish feasts the way they're supposed to be observing it. And yet God sends Ezra. Ezra corrects what they're doing wrong, and once again, God is willing to work with His people when they're willing to fix the issue. We see the grace of God over and over and over again in these restoration books. And when you look at that list, you look at what we've studied and covered so far, it should teach you something about the process of restoration. It teaches us it's not always smooth. It's not always straightforward. That a lot of times it's 5 steps forward and 3 steps back. But God is willing and ready to work with these people again and again and again, even when they fall flat on their face and they aren't what they ought to be. Which does raise the question, I'm curious. If you're God working with these exiles, at what point do you give up? When are you done with your people? That could be a rhetorical question, or if you really want an interesting class, I mean, you could legitimately answer it. That's totally up to you, but I'm only going to wait about 3 more seconds. Okay, yeah, so he certainly did. You'd wait 40 years. Okay. Very good. There you go. Can someone knit that on a pillow and give it to Roland for his birthday? If I were God, you'd get 40 years. I love that. Anybody else have a specific answer? At what point do you give up? There you go. It's biblical. I mean, there you go. Yeah. Well, and that's what you see. At some point, I have to think that if I'm working with people, at some point I'm going to give up on them. But we see in God over and over and over again that He keeps sticking with them. He keeps working on them. And that's important because these people are going to need grace over and over and over again. Now, I did have it in my mind that we should read Nehemiah chapter 9, but I think we're going to really, really fall short if we do that. And it's kind of a shame. It's one of the most beautiful passages in here. I encourage you to take some time this coming week and read through it. This is a prayer of confession that Nehemiah offers on behalf of himself and the people to God, confessing their sin before Him, asking for His forgiveness and reconciliation with Him. And the best part about it is that this prayer really illustrates the thing we've been talking about. See, we don't just see God's grace over and over and over again in the restoration age. And Nehemiah points out we see it all throughout God's interaction with these people. This prayer is all about, hey, how, God, you did this amazing thing, but we were wicked and we fell short, but then you took us back. Hey, God, we did this wicked thing again, but you took us back. We did another wicked thing, but you took us back. He goes through the history of the people, showing how the grace of God has been involved in their lives again and again and again. And the whole point of that is, here we are once again. We've been sinning against God. We haven't been the people we ought to be. But God, we trust that once again, you're going to show us your grace when we are willing to try again. Now, all of that culminates in Nehemiah 9 in verse 38. After this long prayer of confession, we see this very interesting thing happen. It says, now because of all of this, we are making an agreement in writing, and on the sealed document are the names of our leaders, our Levites, and our priests. And so what I want you to see is that they decide here in Nehemiah chapter 10, I wasn't expecting that. Oh, here we go. They decide that they're going to make this agreement in writing. They've been guilty, and now what they're going to do is they're not just going to confess their sins, they're not just going to pray this prayer, but they're going to formulate this document. And they're going to state in this document exactly what they're going to give to God and how things are going to be different. And then they take all their leaders and all the people who agree to this and they sign it. Now, you may have already seen. What is significant about making this agreement in writing? The idea that they're not just gathering together after this prayer and saying, hey, this is a good idea, this is what we should do. But they're actually putting pen to paper and signing their names to this document. What's significant about that? What's important about that? Yeah. Okay, so there's no going back on it, right? No going, hey, I didn't agree to that. I didn't say I would do that. It's right here. There's your signature. That's what a signature is used for, to testify that you agreed to this certain thing. And so there's no going back on this. Yes, sir. Oomph. Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. There's a sense in which it becomes more real when you put pen to paper, when you actually sign your name to that thing. And I think what's happening here is, first of all, they're confessing their sins publicly, and by signing this document, they're admitting that they've sinned in this way, which is a pretty big thing that I think we could learn from. We aren't very big on confessing our sins publicly these days. I was going to move on, but if Les wants to say something about that, I'm going to hear what he has to say. Yeah, absolutely. So we do that in marriage, right? We also sign a document in marriage, right? Which, when I did perform one wedding where I almost left and forgot to sign the document. I think that was my first one. They caught me before I did. But that does add a sense of legality to it, realness to it. It's necessary for these two people to be bound together so you can look at that document and say. And then, of course, we have that public confession that they do in the presence of witnesses. They agree to be bound together with one another. And so they're confessing their sins publicly. They're also agreeing to be held accountable, and that's a very important thing. I'm going to sign my name to this so that other people can look at this document years from now and can look at my life in comparison to what I agreed and can point out to me that I'm not doing what I said I would do. And it's not just agreeing to be held accountable, but it is agreeing to hold others accountable. Not only am I saying, hey, you can talk to me if I'm out of line with what I agreed to, but I'm saying I'm going to hold you accountable for the things that you've agreed to. All of this is very good and very healthy. We see these people creating a culture of accountability amongst themselves. I want to ask you, is that an easy thing to do, to create a culture of accountability? Why is it difficult, and what can we do to be a little bit better at creating a culture of accountability amongst ourselves? Yeah. So that requires admitting that we're wrong. We don't like other people to tell us what we need to do, even when we have a problem, right? If I have a problem, I still don't like you telling me I have a problem because I think to myself, you be quiet. I got this figured out. I know I should have done that, but don't worry. I've got it from here, right? Even though all evidence points to the contrary. Miss Jenny, you're going to say something. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. Well, it does require a deep level of trust in other people, which is very difficult. It requires a level of vulnerability. And I would say that to a large degree, it requires a lot of humility. It requires a lot of humility for me to say, I'm okay with you knowing that I haven't been everything that I need to be. And I'm okay with you knowing that I need help. And those are two things that we really don't like other people to know about us, even though everybody in the room knows that it's true. We know it mentally, we know it theoretically, but we don't know it emotionally, right? If I were to look at Mr. Mark and say, hey, Mr. Mark, you mess up, right? You'd say yes, right? If I were to say, hey, we all mess up, right? Everybody's on board with that. But when I say, hey, tell me what you did wrong over this past year, that's when it becomes real. It's hard to admit that to one another. And it requires a deep level of humility to be able to engage in that kind of accountability. That's what they're doing. And I think they do it because they recognize the situation they're in. They've been humbled by realizing how far they've fallen from God's rules. They've been humbled by the prayer of confession that Nehemiah offers on behalf of all of them. And because they've been humbled, they're willing to engage in this wonderful accountability. Now, not only do they sign this document, but in this document they say exactly what they've agreed to do. It says, Nehemiah 10, verse 1, now on the sealed document were the names of Nehemiah the governor, the son of Hakaliah, and Zedekiah, and a bunch of other names going all the way down to verse 28. Now, this is what it says. This is what was in the document. Now the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, all those who had knowledge and understanding, are joining with their kinsmen, their nobles, and are taking on themselves a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given through Moses, God's servant, and to keep and to observe all the commandments of God our Lord, and his ordinances and his statutes, and that we will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land, or take their daughters for our sons. As for the peoples of the land who bring wares or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath day or holy day, and we will forego the crops the 7th year in the exaction of every debt. We also placed ourselves under obligation to contribute yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the service of the house of our God, for the showbread, for the continual grain offering, for the continual burnt offering, the Sabbaths, the new moon, for the appointed times, for the holy things, and for the sin offerings to make atonement for Israel, in all the work of the house of our God. Likewise we cast lots for the supply of wood among the priests, the Levites, and all the people, so that they might bring it to the house of our God according to our fathers' households at fixed times annually, to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. And that they might bring the firstfruits of our ground, and the firstfruits of all the fruit of every tree of the house of the Lord annually. And bring to the house of our God the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, and the firstborn of our herds and of our flocks, as is written in the law, for the priests who are ministering in the house of God. We will also bring the first of our dough, our contributions, the first of every tree, the new wine and the oil to the priests at the chambers of the house of God, and the tithe of our ground to the Levites, for the Levites are they who receive the tithes in all the rural towns. The priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites receive tithes, and the Levites shall bring up the 10th of the tithes to the house of our God, to the chambers of the storehouse. For the sons of Israel and the sons of Levi shall bring the contribution of the grain, the new wine, and the oil of the chambers. There are the utensils of the sanctuary, the priests who are ministering, the gatekeepers and the singers. Thus we will not neglect the house of our God. So that's a lot of commitments, a lot of old law stuff. But there are some important things that I want to point out to you that they agreed to do. Notice, first of all, that they said that they were not going to intermarry with the other nations. We are not going to give our sons to their daughters, and we're not going to take their daughters for our sons. We are going to be separate and holy, just like Ezra told us we were supposed to do. They also say we're not going to violate the Sabbath. We're going to make sure the Sabbath is holy, and we're going to make sure that is the way that it ought to be. Something interesting about this that I wonder if I have time to talk about. I think I do. They also say, look what it says in verse 31. In verse 31, it says, as for the peoples of the land who bring wares or any grain on the Sabbath or holy day, and we will forego the crops the 7th year in the exaction of every debt. That idea that they're going to forego the crops of every 7th year is deeply connected to these people and to their exile in the first place. One of the things that was written in the law of Moses, if you want to write it down, Leviticus 25, 1 through 7, one of the rules they were given was that when they entered the land, they were supposed to leave the ground fallow every 7th year. And this was, as they observed the Sabbath, not only because they rested on the 7th day, but they also let the land observe its own Sabbath by not planting and reaping in the 7th year. One of the interesting things about this is that that law was never observed. And when they go into captivity, if you look at 2 Chronicles 36, 20 through 21, it says that they go into captivity so that their land can enjoy all of its Sabbaths. In other words, for all of this time that they've been in the land, they have failed to let the land rest in the 7th year. And God takes them out of the land so that the land can enjoy all the Sabbaths that it's missed, and then he brings them back after 70 years. You look at that connection between Leviticus 25 and 2 Chronicles 36. It's actually really interesting. And here these people are. They're finally back in the land, and they say, well, we never did that before. We're going to start doing that. Every 7th year, we will not plant. We will not reap. We're going to let the land have its Sabbaths. They say in verse 32 and 33 that they are going to support the work in the house of their God. In verse 34, they say, we're going to give the priest what they need in order to perform their service. And then in verses 35 through 39, we see that they promise to bring their first of everything so that they can offer to the Lord what they promised to give, what he is due from them. The cool thing about this is that notice how all of this is calculated to ensure that they don't neglect the house of God. And I like that very much. Because when we think about Nehemiah, we think about what? Building what? Think about Nehemiah building walls, right? But when Nehemiah is leaving, because remember, all of this is in context of he's built the walls, he knows he has to go back, so he's getting the people ready for when he leaves. When he leaves, he doesn't leave them instructions for, hey, here's how you take care of wall maintenance. And here are the people who need to be on the turrets and the ramparts, and here's all the things you need to do to make sure the wall stays good. When he leaves, he's not worried about maintaining the wall. What's he worried about? He's worried about maintaining the house of God. He knows that God's house is the thing that really matters even more than the walls that he and the people have built. And so he wants to make sure that it is cared for and well maintained in his absence. So, at the end of Nehemiah 10, they sign the document, they make their promises, and they seal it up. Now, we are going to move quickly through Nehemiah chapter 11 and 12, mostly because a lot of it is genealogical repeat, but we'll cover some of it. All of it's important and should be discussed, but I really want to get to Nehemiah 13 before this class is over. And my notes just skipped over a page, which took me straight to Nehemiah 13. So that's, I don't know, a sign or something. Something interesting that we see at the beginning of Nehemiah 11 is that Nehemiah is helping the people decide who's going to live in Jerusalem. Look at what it says there in verse 1. It says, "Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, but the rest of the people cast lots to bring out 1 of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9/10 remained in the other cities. And the people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. Now these are the heads of the provinces who lived in Jerusalem, but in the cities of Judah each lived on his own property in their cities, the Israelites, the priests, the Levites, the temple servants, and the descendants of Solomon's servants." Now it's interesting that at this point in the story, they've been back from captivity so long. It's empty. It's interesting they point out that Jerusalem's kind of empty, that it's not being filled the way it should be filled. And not only that, but when they're trying to decide who's going to live there, they have to cast lots to decide who's going to live there and who's going to stay in the neighboring cities. And it all seems to imply that living in Jerusalem isn't technically something that the people want to do. At least that's the implication I gleaned from it. Maybe you're thinking it's the opposite. Maybe the people who win the lottery, hey, I get to live in Jerusalem. It seems like they don't want to live in it because the people who are chosen, it says, all the people praise them because they got to live in Jerusalem. And that makes it seem like, hey, we're happy you're living there. We're glad we don't have to live there. Why wouldn't they want to live in Jerusalem? What would the deal with that be? They were mostly farmers, okay, so not living in city life, right? Maybe it's better to live in the rural areas. Maybe so. Yes, sir. Yeah. This is kind of the epicenter of everything. It's been destroyed. It's where all the captives were taken out. It's where all of the enemies have gathered around to try to destroy it recently. You kind of think to yourself, hey, if I'm in one of those cities of the north, yeah, the temple's not right there, and maybe I have to travel there 3 times a year for these festivals and all that, but I don't have the target on my back like I do if I live in Jerusalem. But these people, they are chosen to live in Jerusalem when the lots are cast. You were going to say something? shoulder that responsibility. Yeah, absolutely. I could definitely see that. I do want to ask, it says that they cast lots. This was an Old Testament process. I'm not exactly sure. I don't think anyone's sure exactly what that looked like, but it was a process of, casting lots and just seeing who was decided almost by fate, but really by providence. What does it say about them that when they were deciding how this was going to be figured out, they decided to cast lots? Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. It's hard to find IT people. Yeah, now and then. That's definitely true. IT and OT. Very good. Very good. Yeah, I like that. Anybody's acceptable. I want you to think about how this might work differently if we were doing this today. So let's imagine that, and this is wild hypothetical. Let's imagine that this church could only fit so many people. Something happened, I don't know. And people had to scatter abroad, and only a certain amount of people could stay. Imagine how we would handle that process. How do we decide who stays and who goes? How would we handle that? Huh? Okay, so maybe we would say, hey, let's get some volunteers. What if nobody wanted to stay? How do we decide then? And in my mind, I'm thinking to myself, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sit down with a list of the membership and a highlighter or something, and I'm going to pick out the people that need to stay. Well, this person needs to be here so they can do this job, and this person needs to be here so they can do this job, and this person is a really good encourager, so we need them, and this person can speak really well, this person prays really well, so let's get these people, and I want to manipulate it and control it. And they don't do that. What do? They cast lots, and they leave it in the hands of God. And so while I'm not endorsing that we make our decisions that way these days, I am saying that you do learn something. They're content to let God make this decision, not to control it or manipulate it themselves. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. We don't avoid it because it's unscriptural. We avoid it because it makes us uncomfortable. The idea of putting this decision in God's hands. Yes, ma'am. My guess would be that you have some volunteers and you have some who are chosen by lot. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe you have a little bit of both. That's how I would make sense of it. Standing right here, thinking on my feet in the middle of class. Okay, so maybe that's what it is. Yeah, so maybe they volunteered to be a part of the casting lots process. That's also a good way to resolve that tension. I want to point out, let's see how much time I have. Okay. I'm going to skip past a little bit of Nehemiah chapter 12, although I had a good point to make here about younger generations. In Nehemiah chapter 12, it's a recounting of the genealogy that you find in Ezra chapter 2. In other words, these people, they wanted to make sure all the people got in their right positions. So they went back to the genealogy that Zerubbabel took at the very beginning of the exile to make sure that everybody's genealogy fit. And it just shows us something really cool that, again, it emphasizes their carefulness. They want to make sure the right people are in the right positions and things are done the right way. If you're a priest, then you can be a priest. If you have the right lineage, you can be a Levite. But we want to make sure you have that right lineage before we let you do that. The second thing I want to point out there is the fact that they're able to do that speaks to the value of the previous generation and their carefulness. Because Zerubbabel and all of those people were careful at the very beginning of the exile, Nehemiah and all these leaders are able to go back and find that record, and they can be careful to observe God's law because of what the previous generation did. And I think that's a really cool point to make, that a previous generation's carefulness can benefit a following generation. You know, one of the mentality that I find in younger people is kind of this attitude that says, hey, we know some churches out there, some denominations, they got stuff wrong, but look, don't we all have stuff wrong? I mean, they've got stuff wrong. We're people just like them. Don't we have stuff wrong too? It's impossible to imagine that we don't have anything wrong because everybody's got something wrong. And the answer to that is, I think, kind of in line with this. That we can stand here today feeling very fairly convinced that we stand on good ground, in part because we benefited from our predecessors who were very careful with the way they handled the text. That doesn't mean that we should throw out our brain and not examine the text, but it does mean that if the previous generations were careful about how they read the Word of God and how they established the church and how, I guess, built the church, Jesus established the church. If the previous generations were careful, then we can feel comfortable sitting on their shoulders. They do us a benefit by being careful. That enables us to follow in their footsteps. Did that make sense? That felt like a bunch of gumbo coming out of my mouth. But all I'm trying to say is, I think to a large degree, the previous generations were careful to make sure they observed God's law, while others were not very careful that they observed God's law. And for that reason, I think we have great benefit from the carefulness of previous generations. Yes, ma'am? Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Well, and that's a wonderful point, right? And so we see they're benefited from the fact that they kept those genealogies, but they also have the humility to admit, yeah, those previous generations, they didn't have this right at all, and they didn't try to make excuses for them because it wasn't traditional or because it admitted that Granny and Granddaddy didn't do things the right way. They didn't do the Feast of Booths the right way. They're willing to admit that and change when they see something that's different. That's a wonderful point. Thank you. Man, I'm not leaving myself enough time to do this. This is yikes. Okay. I'm going to soldier on. I'll just end the class mid-sentence. Here, at this point, is where we get into some weird chronological stuff in the book of Nehemiah. I want you to see something that happens in Nehemiah 13. This is important. In Nehemiah 13 and verse 6, I want you to notice that Nehemiah says, "But during all this time, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king. After some time, however, I asked leave of the king." So, there's some weirdness in here because we know that Nehemiah takes 2 trips to Jerusalem. The first trip obviously happens in Nehemiah chapter 2, and the second trip we read about in Nehemiah 13, but the text never tells us when Nehemiah went home. It kind of just runs all the way through, and then Nehemiah at some point is like, yeah, I wasn't here during all of that, but now I'm back. And it's not really sure, and if you read commentators, they're baffled as well. I talked to Andrew Stafford. He doesn't know either, so there you go. If you're reading this, if you want my opinion, I think what happens is Nehemiah goes home for 12 years, historically speaking, between verse 26 and 27. And I think that because starting in verse 27, you have these time markers that run all the way through the end of the book. It starts in verse 27, it says, "Now at the dedication of the wall," and then continue on down to 43, it says, "On that day." If you look at verse 44, it says, "On that day." If you look at 13 and verse 1, it says, "On that day." And then in verse 4 of chapter 13, it says, now prior to this. And so I think what happens is, if you want to make a time marker there, Nehemiah leaves at 12:26, and he comes home at 12:27. And 27 tells us about this wonderful dedication of the wall of Jerusalem. They had this huge worship service that encompassed the entire city. And I think, if I understand the story correctly, Nehemiah had gone home, but the reason he came back was so that he could be a part of this wonderful wall dedicating ceremony that happens in Jerusalem. I could be wrong about that, but if you read through it, you'll be struck by just how weird the timelines are and all of that. And I think Andrew agreed with me that my idea made the most sense. So I'm going to stake my claim on that. But even though Nehemiah goes back for this joyful celebration, the dedication of the wall, what he finds when he gets back is that these people are in a really, really terrible situation. This trip that should be a joyful occasion reveals that serious problems had cropped up among God's people. Once again, even though he'd set everything in place and he tried to make sure they were going to be okay when he left, everything's a mess in Jerusalem. And what's worse than all of that is that the things they had promised that they were going to take care of are exactly the things that they went back on. So you'll find in 13, that in verses 10 through 14, it says that they were not supporting, they were not providing for the priests, and they were not bringing in the first fruits like they should. They had signed that document. They said they would, and yet Nehemiah comes back and says, you're not doing any of that. If you look up here, it says in 15 verses 15 through 22, it says they were also violating the Sabbath. They were buying and selling, and they were doing all of those things they promised they wouldn't do on the Sabbath day. And I have to believe, since it's been a period of 12 years, and they're not keeping the Sabbath ordinarily, they're probably not keeping that seventh year Sabbath either. They're doing all the stuff they said they wouldn't do. And of course also we see that they're intermarrying with other nations around them and mixing in with the surrounding people. When we come back to class, because I am out of time, we come back to class on Sunday, we're going to dig a little bit into Nehemiah 13 and look at how far these people had departed from God. And we're going to see if we can learn a few things about this terrible, diabolical departure that happened just 12 years after Nehemiah left. All right. So next time we'll do Nehemiah 13, if you want to read that. And we'll also do a little bit of recap on Ezra and Nehemiah and all the stuff we've covered so far this quarter.